in the introduction, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and hopefully that hits on most time zones that we have today. I'm here today, very excited to talk to you about selling to the enterprise in the age of GDPR. So just as a preface, this isn't about GDPR or about privacy or about cybersecurity and kind of how to. There's plenty of that information around. This is really about giving you an idea of how important cybersecurity and privacy is, kind of in general, and more specifically if you're building a product as an entrepreneur, or product manager, or selling a product as a salesperson or a marketer even, on not just so you understand why cybersecurity and privacy is important, but also so you know how to talk about it and engage about it with your various customers and stakeholders. With that, we'll skip myself since I was already introduced. Primary goals for this session is you'll understand enterprises' top security and privacy concerns when you engage startups. This is primarily geared to entrepreneurs, but as I mentioned before, it goes broader than that. You'll learn how enterprises evaluate third-party risk, which is you as a vendor trying to sell to an enterprise. And we'll talk about some next steps to talk the walk around security and privacy, GDPR, etc. Yeah, so any talk starting about privacy, cybersecurity I have to start with scaring you a bit. It's kind of mandatory, and but kind of bear with me. We'll get you out of it and go on to more positive notes. But this is sort of a mandatory part that we have to go through because the reality is that most of us on a day-to-day and kind of mainstream news, you don't really hear about it too much unless it's something very sensational or very unusual, interesting for the first time, and then it pretty much becomes business as normal, and you just don't hear about it again until the next big thing happens. But the reality is that there are massive breaches happening every day and all the time. Like kind of breaches have been, they're now like very scientific, very engineered, very automated. You don't have to be in anybody's crosshairs to be breached. There are these automatic bots, scripts, etc., that just run and scan for certain vulnerabilities, certain ways to get in, and then once they're in, they look for something very specific or can be used in various ways depending on what the attacker planned. But the important thing to understand is that nobody has to like specifically have it out for you. So if you're in a relatively small and unknown company or even a startup that has barely raised seed yet, you could still be a victim of a cybersecurity attack simply because of the level of scale and automation that those have reached. And just looking here, I told this off a few months ago in 2020. There are a lot of logos here. I'm sure you know. There are a lot you don't know. You probably have heard of maybe like 2 or 3 of the breaches that happened on this site. Like most likely, Facebook and Capital One, at least in the U.S. They were really big. Marriott, there was a really big one. But as I say, they're just happening all the time. The sizes of the circles on here, by the way, are an indication of just how big a breach it was as far as number of records that were removed. But honestly, breach isn't just number of records removed. There's like a lot of other ways to measure it as well. The important thing is that you have, I think, some idea of scale and just how often it happens. So we said breaches happened. I'm sure everyone by now has heard a little bit about GDPR, so I'm going to talk about it a bit even before introducing it. But the key thing that got everybody's attention in GDPR, but it's certainly not the most important thing about GDPR, is the size of the fines, up to 4% of annual global revenue per instance, or 20 million, I think it's euros, if you're a very small company that doesn't have a bunch of revenue yet. And so that went into effect now a little over, or just about 2.5 years ago. So far, about 350 GDPR fines have been issued. Total amount of fines has been only about 200 million euros. The largest fine was on Google for 50 million. Smallest fine was, just I guess as an anecdote, just 90 euros of a small Hungarian hospital. That's GDPR so far, but you may have already heard on the news because they did make some headlines, but British Airways and Marriott that each had significant breaches. They are The fine hasn't been levied yet, but the direction it's going, or what the or what kind of governments have said that they're going after, is something around these ranges of numbers. So you can expect these numbers of fines to keep climbing persistently, and so it definitely gets everyone's attention. Next, so attackers are so it's kind of what's driving all this, right? So attackers are driven by unprecedented value, volume, and vulnerability of data. If you're all in the big data space, then you're probably aware of much of this. So first off, just how valuable the data is. Data is the new oil, right? We all know that. The volume of data, we all know that how fast data is growing and how unwieldy it is. And 2025 is supposed to hit 163 zettabytes worldwide. And finally, and very crucially, all this data is highly vulnerable because of just the amount of complexity out there in all these enterprise IT environments, between hybrid computing, fog computing, bring your own device, bring your own technology, IoT, the whole on-prem and cloud covered in the hybrid point. That just makes all these networks highly vulnerable. All this translates to a very big and attractive, economically viable target that's not very well defended, right? And that all translates into security risk that just drives the attack volume up and drives the sophistication up, even though a lot of the attacks that are happening are very low sophistication. And I think the final piece of the puzzle that came in is the whole digital currencies and Bitcoins. There's now a clear way to actually monetize on cybersecurity breaches. If in the past it was primarily nation states, or maybe some hacktivism, some way to get attention, some people just being bored and trying to do something cool, kind of in recent years, it's very clear I can basically shut down your site until you agree to pay me X amount of Bitcoin, or you lose all your data, you lose all your site. All depends on how good your backups are. Typically, they're not that great. But basically, yeah, that whole making the whole thing easy to now monetize means it's a very attractive target for a lot of organizations to just go out and go after all this value that's out there, and they'll be able to basically make a lot of money and get away with it. All right, so let's switch gears a little and talk about third-party risk. Because again, my main focus here is about selling to enterprises who actually sell to another end user or something like that. Less about direct-to-consumer, even though a lot of this is applicable as well. And so when you're selling to the enterprise, they're thinking now, wow, I'm going to give this other vendor access to a lot of my data, a lot of my processes, either because they now can access my own IT systems, or because they're just pulling it all into their IT systems, or I'm using their SaaS product. So I port everything on there, but in any case, I now need to trust them with all this highly valuable data. Now, just as a little bit of background, maybe around 2014, the United States government's HR arm was breached. It's believed that by the Chinese government or Chinese military, and they were breached through an independent, by a third party vendor whose credentials were stolen, and this vendor was somebody who does background checks. And if you have also some idea about background checks, they typically uncover and store all the information about an individual that can be used to extort them or make them betray their country, any kind of thing like that, right? So all that is uncovered in there. It's like the most private information that you're going to share to get a security clearance to make sure it's kind of all out there and won't be used against you, but you don't necessarily want everybody to know it, right? Things like relatives in jail and ugly divorces and like credit score that may have gone bad at some point, but you managed to fix it. All kinds of these things in your background that you wouldn't necessarily want to get out. That's what was able to get out, and that's really made the U.S. government focus a lot more on not just third-party risk, but just overall their cybersecurity stance. And sort of as part of the investigation, they found that not only did this third party, not do things right, etc. But just basically across the government, data was being unencrypted, networks were unsegmented, there was a lot of unmanaged legacy. Basically all the bad stuff that happens if cybersecurity isn't managed very proactively. And as a result of that, the U.S. Government has really upped its game on cybersecurity, but it's still a massive threat. Other breaches you may have heard of are like Target. Also, there was a third-party breach. Basically, I think it was an HVAC supplier whose credentials were stolen to access actually a supplier portal. But then, because IT systems are so interconnected in the back, the attacker managed from that system to go into all kinds of other systems and basically download everybody's personal information and specifically credit card data. So it's getting a lot more attention, and if that wasn't enough, by now everybody I think on this call knows about GDPR. Took effect in 2018. We talked about the fines already. It did, one of the clear things that it does around third party is basically determine this data controller aspect versus data processor, and it basically means if I as a consumer give you my data, you're accountable to me as the data controller, and you don't outsource the risk or your accountability to me just because you hired some third party to do some data processing or store the data or any kind of thing like that. And so you're on the hook as the data controller, and also your data processor is on the hook as well. And that's really there's a lot more like precise legal definitions of what each one is, and there are a lot of interesting circumstances of who counts as what. But that's kind of the basic gist for our conversation. But bottom line is, if you're going to sell to an enterprise who has end users, customers, employees, they got to take care of their data. They're the controller typically for that transaction, and you're the processor. Again, typically, there are all kinds of weird other cases. What else? GDPR says there are technical and organizational measures that companies need to put in place. So it's not just, oh yeah, we bought this technology or whatever, but you need to actually show that you've put these measures in place to safeguard the privacy and security of the data. And those measures have to be state of the art. So if you have something legacy there, it's not enough to check the box. You have to be able to also demonstrate that it's state of the art. So yeah, we'll get into this a little bit more in a little bit. But kind of important to note, third-party breaches, they keep happening again and again and again. I only talked about a couple examples, but this is one that I think last time I gave the presentation was kind of too good to resist and fairly recent in May 2020. But basically, yeah, law firms get actually breached a lot because they have a lot of contracts and personal information, et cetera. And then it makes it onto front page news as soon as it's celebrities. But it just happens a lot. And of course, it happened because of a third-party breach. Okay, let's talk a little bit about we've started touching it, but more broadly about top cybersecurity trends that affect third parties. So first is borderless infrastructure. So those enterprises between going to the cloud, having hybrid IT, employees bringing their own devices, and of course recently like working from home sometimes with their own devices. Not everybody had necessarily a laptop before lockdown. Bring your own technology. This is a team deciding to use Slack, even though it's not like a CIO-approved IT system, or at least wasn't when they got started, right? Similar thing, Box, kind of everything that happens with the grassroots marketing of tech that's become very popular in this SaaS world we live in. Shadow IT, of course, is sort of the bigger name for that. And yeah, most recently, work from home. So what has that done? So for a large extent, it really drove the point home that you can't really prevent all the attacks. So you switch to detecting that you've been attacked and then being able to mitigate and sort of fix that attack after it has happened. And a big shift from just securing your company network to actually focusing more on the data, the app, and the identity layers of security. Next, the human factor. 90% of breaches actually begin with phishing. So even just teaching your employees what a phishing email looks like, even a good one, and training them on how to not click on those clicks, for example, and how to be suspicious will actually go a long way. And kind of the other side of that coin is there just aren't enough security professionals right now. There's been for years now talk about shortage of security professionals and a lot of demand for them, so they can't actually there's just only so far they can stretch, right? And it goes to some of the problem around how do you manage all these vulnerabilities. Next, just interconnectivity. Because all the systems are connected, a very localized breach could very quickly go to your crown jewels and your most important assets. The other kind of aspect of it is, okay, I'm buying your little best of breed HR solution, maybe to plug aside my bigger HR system, but how do you actually integrate with my other security tools like identity access management or looking at logs to identify breaches, that kind of thing. Next, DevSecOps. So business velocity is increasing so much that's forcing like IT and technology products to move very quickly with multiple releases a day. It means that sort of the old way of doing security, where just stage gate somewhere in the process, just doesn't work anymore, and being kind of a naysayer and slowing everybody down is just going to cripple the business. So it's pushing security into DevOps to become DevSecOps. There's a lot more security training and tools out there that's tailored for actually developers who in the past bother themselves with security too much. Yeah, finally, and we talked about this a little bit, government involvement. So privacy, data residency, and security laws are now proliferating everywhere. So pretty much governments across the world have taken GDPR and said, okay, how do we customize this and tailor this best for what we're trying to achieve? So Russia has their own version, China has their own version, India, I think, is in the late stages of draft number 2 now, and they're close to their final version. Brazil has a version, California has a version. They're just now everywhere and just making it a lot more complicated also for companies to manage. The next thing is cybersecurity and privacy is now becoming the new national security. If you're breached in the US or something like that, you might get a call from the FBI. They might even know that you're breached before you were breached. And they'll look to coordinate and help you and that type of thing, because more and more the two things are intertwined. Like through a breach of security, you can cripple a country's economy or bring down some very important infrastructure or companies that kind of make everything run. Or really harm the citizens. So governments are getting more and more involved. And finally, regulations are used a lot also as trade barriers. So if I said everybody's customizing GDPR, well, sometimes privacy is really just an excuse, even in Europe, but in other countries as well. A lot of times what creeps in there is, hey, we'd really like to have like serious infrastructure as a service or software as a service vendors grow locally, and we got to help them if we can. So let's put up this barrier around what companies can do with our data, and kind of at the very minimum, maybe those foreign companies will build a center of excellence or a data center or something like that in our country, so we get some jobs out of it, and we can kind of excuse it all through national security or privacy or for citizens or something like that. So there's a lot of that going around as well. All right, so let's kind of switch ahead a little bit. As I mentioned already, I'm more tailored in this talk towards what do you need to know to like build and sell products in enterprises. So here's how the typical sales cycle used to work. It's becoming less and less common. Basically, the solution is pitched, the customer gets excited, there are workshops, there are negotiations, then the customer's about to sign. Then all of a sudden, you know, the other side just goes silent. Like they're about to sign, but then, okay, 2 weeks pass, you don't hear anything, you start reaching out, and it's like, oh, our cybersecurity team has a few questions because they just found out about it now, and they're all kinds of, maybe part of the procurement policy at some point is to check with them. Maybe they heard about it through some rumor. They get involved, they start asking hard questions, and then your contract can really get derailed, can get delayed several months. And this isn't just for a startup. So this slide is actually from, I took it off of SAP's own sales enablement training. So SAP sees this as well. If we sell to customers and if we don't engage their cybersecurity team early on in the process, we get derailed, and sometimes the deals, the pipelines, right, they'll like slip to the next quarter or to the next year. It has a negative impact on the salesperson themselves, and of course on the company and our financial reports and everything from the market, etc. Let's switch gears. So until now, I kind of, as I promised, I had to share with you a little bit of maybe scare you off a little bit. Now let's switch to the empowerment part and what you can do about it to kind of win in this new environment. Maybe even turn around the chairs, because assuming you work for a relatively small and agile company or you're a startup entrepreneur, if you do these things right, at least for a while, could still be a differentiator for you against some of your competitors who haven't caught up yet. Stop just looking at the other sales process. So just add that new step in the beginning after the solution was pitched, even at the end of that first pitch. Just see if you can get the customer's security team engaged, right? Just even saying something like, oh, hey, in our solution, security privacy is top of mind for us. Here's a white paper, or here's a landing page about the types of things that we do. We'd love it if you could share it with your security team, and here's my card. Have them reach out to me if they have any other questions. That way they can start their process, which can sometimes be a blocker and take months. They can start it right up front as part of the sales process, right? And so by the time the customer is ready to sign, the customer security team is ready to sign off, right? And then you can complete the deal on time. The other thing to remember is, like, in some cases, maybe the customer's security privacy team in companies where those are kind of stronger and more ingrained in the process, if you have them actually rooting for your solution versus just checking off on it, that might be the deal breaker for a company considering you versus a competitor. Basically, if the security team is saying out there and like, hey, this company has it all figured out. They're doing everything right. I have no concerns with them. This other company, on the other hand, I'd really rather we didn't work with them. I'd have a bunch of questions for them to ask. There are a lot of things we have to do. There are a lot of concerns we have. Let's just go with this one. That may actually end up clinching the deal for you. So just something to keep in mind as the next level. So next, if we take a bit of a customer-centric approach here, when they're evaluating their potential vendors, when their security teams are evaluating those vendors, they're basically trying to understand, okay, do you know how to deliver security? Do you actually have the ability to deliver it? And do you actually intend to deliver and invest in it, or is it all kind of marketing and talk, right? And kind of I took this off of a great talk that was given at RSA. That's the world's biggest cybersecurity conference a couple years ago. And I thought it was really great. Anybody who knows kind of the Myers-Briggs framework, then here's a way for security professionals to kind of think about their potential vendors, bucket them into these groups, and then decide how to deal with them depending on which group they end up in. Obviously, the ideal dream supplier is someone who knows, is able, and actually intends to deliver. And if you can find those, then great. Remember, I told you cybersecurity teams are stretched thinly. There are not enough of those professionals to go around. So if they have you bucketed as a dream supplier, they'll just sign off on you and go spend their time somewhere else, which is an ideal outcome for you, right? So if you can be proactive and fall into that bucket right away, make your lives a lot easier. Other ones here worth mentioning, right? They're the deceivers, those who kind of talk the talk but don't walk the walk, right? They're the Dunning-Krugers, those who don't really know what they're doing, but kind of have all the processes, all the supposed technology in place, seem like they have all this intent, but it's very clear they don't really understand why they're doing what they're doing. Kind of puppies are fun. I used to, when I gave this talk to SAP.io startups 2 years ago, I used to meet many of those. Kind of new, they're kind of very positive. They want to do everything right. They want to change the world with their startup, right? But kind of the first time they heard about cybersecurity, almost outside of just whatever celebrity breach story makes it to the news, was in my talk, right? What's been really interesting to see over the last couple of years is that the startups are way ahead already on cybersecurity. They're a lot more mature by the time they even get to an SAP.io investment or incubator. And I no longer meet very many companies kind of in that bucket. When I've worked with people in that bucket in the past, I've really enjoyed it, because if they have the intent and they're really positive about it, they're just looking to learn and looking as fast as possible to kind of move up to that dream supplier. So it's not necessarily a bad place to start it. I've really enjoyed working with those companies that are just asking for more, and when they work closely with SAP.io, I bring them in touch with our real experts who work on SAP own products to get them compliant. And so that's always been a great experience. And lastly, of course, they're the Freddy Kruegers. They're those that just don't know about security, don't know how to deliver it, have no intention of delivering it. And those you obviously avoid. So yeah, just a few things to think about, right? So if you can de-risk your offering, right? Like we said, those cybersecurity professionals are very busy, right? If you can just not collect a bunch of sensitive data that you don't have to collect, everything gets a lot easier, right? If you use like fewer vendors yourself and kind of have things consolidated and can demonstrate how you're securing it there, it's also easy. You appear as lower risk, they'll spend less time on you. Next is just exercise and I'd say communicate good security hygiene, right? And then sort of show that knowledge, ability, and intent. So next, even if you have like your first initial meeting with your customers' cybersecurity people, right? They may ask a few questions just randomly around the table to try and even get a sense, just a very basic sniff test of where you fall in, right? So first is, are you affected by, right, whatever the latest buzz vulnerability is, right? Do you even know what that is? Then what are you doing about it? Right, and Meltdown Inspector were like the big thing around 2018 and they carried over into 2019. WannaCry was very big before it. They're kind of, each time there's sort of the leading trend. You need to kind of be aware of kind of what it is and have a good answer to how you're countering it. Next, just have an awareness of what are the top 3 cybersecurity threats to your business and how you're addressing them. It's a very basic part of cybersecurity is to do kind of threat analysis, just understand what your risk is, where you're threatened from. So just be able to communicate that and show that you're on top of it. When your org owns cybersecurity or privacy topic, when you're like a 5-person startup, just it's probably the CTO or the technical founder. Over time, you may get somebody else who spends more of their time on it. But they're going to ask, what are their qualifications? Do you think this is enough? You need to be able to kind of give them confidence that you have the right people on the job. Next, what's your business continuity plan, right? If you are breached, compromised, all your data gets like encrypted and you have to pay ransomware. Basically, you're attacked by ransomware and you have to pay a ransom to get out of it, right? What's your plan there? Do you have backups for all your data? How long would it take you to recover it? Have you ever kind of practiced that process to make sure it actually works? Any kind of thing like that. Next, what PII do you process? Why? How are you using it? How are you securing it? How will you detect a breach? These are all kind of great questions to just assess. Are you even aware of the risk that you have? How risky are you to deal with? What processes do you have in place to respond to data subject requests? So data subject requests, they're like under GDPR, if a former customer or employee reaches out to SAP and says, hey, what kind of private data do you have on me? We need to be able to give them that report. So we need to have a process in place to collect all that data and share it back to the customer, even identify up front that whoever it is who's asking is actually whoever's asking, right? And then all the way to actually giving them what they're asking for. You have to have a process to respond to that, right? Another kind of data subject request that gets a lot of attention is the please delete all your records on me, right? So you have to have a process to first identify if you're even allowed to delete all those records, then like find all those records and actually go and delete the ones that you're allowed to delete, right? In some cases, there are retention periods for certain things that you just have to hold on to that information legally, and so you don't actually need to comply with deleting them, right? So some examples are like tax information that needs to be held for like 7 years in the US, or your employer needs to hold some data about you as an employee even long after you've left. So those things they won't necessarily delete. Next, can we audit or pen test your company, right? Can I hire like a third party to try and attack your system and give me a report of how vulnerable you are, right? That's what a pen test is. Or just audit, just look at what are your processes and how do you complete those around security. Very important, good answers. Well, just don't get flustered to begin with, right? But now hopefully you're ready that you've seen this slide. But basically transparently include processes, technologies, and even your internal audit reports if you have those, or third-party audit reports if you have those. But yeah, it's important not to just say, oh, I use this whatever so-and-so vendor for security and they're the best, so I got to be safe, right? Like, technology isn't going to get you out of security. You need to talk about your policies, your people, training, any kind of thing like that you use to get security. And what the audit reports will do, it's typically a third-party auditor that actually looks and says, yeah, you have all these processes and controls in place, and kind of reports where you have shortcomings. So SAP, for example, will share those with our customers and prospects in many cases. What are some bad answers to avoid? You don't want to say this is too confidential, which used to be a very common question. In my previous employer, Akamai, it actually has security very deep in their DNA. They used to answer these questions. I kind of hope they moved away from that. But that's like the old school of security, whether you did it or not, was to say it was confidential. The better companies at least did it, like Akamai. Other companies just weren't doing any security. That's why it was too confidential. Next is we outsource that to X, right? You want to show that you're responsible in any case and that you know and understand this. You can't sort of put the blame or transfer the responsibility to the third party. It was sort of never right, but GDPR really cemented that it's wrong. Next, it worked so far without it. That's kind of, nobody likes that. It sort of, it hasn't broken yet kind of thing as an answer. No one asked for this before, right? I mean, that's great if you're a startup and it's your first, one of your first sales calls and you get asked, then it's like, all right, let's, the answer should be, let's get our house together and, give me a few days, I'll get back to you, right? And then you quickly do a sprint around getting things in order. As a small startup, you're that agile, and then you can come back with a much better question, but sort of don't sort of blame the customer for asking. Next, we use AWS. This one's very common, like AWS are the best, right? Then we use AWS, then we're good. Of course, that's not a great answer. And finally, if you ever need any info about anyone, just ask, they trust me. And just a question here, and I don't know if we can do this over Zoom. Does anybody know who that's quoting? Any guesses?
Date.
So this was Mark Zuckerberg in the early days of the Facebook.
Oh,
So obviously he's grown a lot since. But sort of the thing to remember is you're kind of the custodian of a lot of people's very private and personal data, and people tend to be very trusting with what they share and with whom, sort of assuming that people would never abuse it. But you really need to sort of understand the gravity of it and treat it with reverence, right? So that's just kind of the parting thought. So obviously none of you would answer the question this way, but it's something to be aware of, because certainly if you're hiring a lot of people to startups, and typically a lot of young people who haven't sort of seen as much in their lives, and who like personally share absolutely everything they do on like TikTok or Instagram or whatever, and can't possibly conceive of somebody else having privacy concerns about that kind of thing. You need to be aware that you do need to kind of trust them and build that culture in your company, to treat the data with reverence and treat people's privacy with reverence. Yeah, so just to, as I said, I get asked, a lot of people say, wait, why is we use AWS a problem? They're the best. So this is kind of the important thing to ask, or the important thing to kind of realize. If phishing is probably the biggest attack vector, the most common third-party attack vector, maybe after phishing, is just S3 buckets. It's like the default on those is more or less is probably not encrypted, and then the default is probably private, but a lot of developers will uncheck that during development phase, because otherwise, you're trying to debug this thing that you built, and it's not working because of all kinds of authentication issues and all this stuff that isn't even in your sprint now, and you'll get to it sometime later. So you end up not encrypting your S3 buckets, and not even putting them just available and referenceable via URL to anyone online, and then you never go back and fix that. And sort of that's been kind of breach after breach. There've been a lot of these. And here I used to like replace and update this story every time I gave the talk, but this story is a little too good to ignore, because it kind of had a lot in it, right? So this is a gay dating website, and basically all the data was on S3 for well over a year, just available to the internet and not even encrypted. 5 million users worldwide. All right, think about private photos that are sent in chats, in dating sites, and as I hear from friends, even more on gay dating sites. Think about all those becoming public, plus all the metadata that goes with those. And remember, these are like global users. Some of them live in countries where it's illegal, still illegal to be gay. And so this dating app had all that data and just didn't even give half a thought to security. What makes this even hurt more is that a researcher found this and reported it to Jacked, and the company, even a year later, did not yet fix it. So that's something to remember. Like even today, it's sort of, things happen all the time in security. As I said, we're moving more from like prevention to response and everything. And there are a lot of good people, good researchers out there that will let you know that something's wrong. They found something. Be extremely responsive to those. That's now sort of almost an accepted part is like bug bounties specifically around security. Be open to those, engage with that community, and definitely fix whatever it is that they bring to you. And remember again, the data, the stuff you hold, it affects real people's lives and can cause them real damage and harm that I'm sure you would have never liked to happen, but just out of negligence if you don't give it the importance that it needs. And this is kind of why just saying we use AWS isn't really enough. Okay, so we talked about the kind of questions they may kind of ask just as a sniff test, but even once you get past that sniff test, you typically get hit with something like a 30-page tight font written questionnaire or like policy document that you need to respond to with what is it that you do for every single one of these bullets across 30 pages. And yeah, I'm not going to go into kind of the various things here, but that's sort of the first time, at least used to be, the first time when the early stage startups would take interest in this talk or follow up with me, is when they got that first questionnaire from an enterprise and needed to kind of figure out what all these abbreviations even mean. Is when the startups typically start getting their house in order on security and realize that they have to, they really have to up their game if they want to sell to the big enterprises. All right, let's switch gears a little to the next step. And I had kind of tips thrown throughout, but so this may be a little more of a summary. So first off, on how to just talk the talk. Right, so first, engage customers' security teams early. Don't wait for the end. Next is hire someone who can talk security, someone who kind of knows the jargon, who follows what's going on, will understand the customer questions, will be able to answer the customer security professionals' questions in kind of the language that, again, demonstrates that your company gets it. If you don't have that person yet, as soon as you kind of get big enough or start selling in enterprises, you're going to need that person. Next is create brief marketing collateral, even a 2-page PDF in the beginning to say, like, overall, what data do you collect, how you use it, and how you're securing it. Even that'll go a long way. You can Google SAP Trust Center. You can see what we have on there. Obviously, we're a bigger company. We have a little more on there. But once you get sort of external third-party certifications and all that kind of thing, like that you're ISO compliant or whatever, you have that on there as well. Those are all good confidence builders for customers. Next is embrace those customers' questionnaires. So you're going to get that 30-page questionnaire. That's not where the discussion ends. That's where the discussion begins. So you start by basically populating that with, okay, what are the things I do? Even use that as a gap analysis, right? And if you're a small, nimble startup, you can, a few sprints, probably close some of the biggest gaps. But then respond to that questionnaire kind of openly and transparently with what you have and what it is you're doing and working to improve. Typically, what you'll find is for a lot of companies, that's really just the compliance step. They may just take it, stick it in a drawer, check off the box and move on, and never even worry about all the questions that you're really worried about because you didn't have a good answer for. That may just happen, or they may just tell you, or if that customer really wants to work with you, right, their security person will basically work with you and just say, hey, why don't you fix like these three things by go live, and then we'll talk to you about what's later, or it's okay if you address all these others over the next kind of year or two, or really these 3 things are the only thing we care about. Just remember, it's a conversation starter. It's not a slam door. And finally, manage the visible posture. So most of cybersecurity is actually not externally visible. It's your employees, it's your company processes, your policies, the level of training, all kinds of stuff like that, or even kind of internal technology that isn't visibly externally. But some of it is visible, very visible, very easy to spot, even from outside. Like for example, does your website landing page, is it like the latest in HTTPS? It's not all kind of little locks on the web screen are the same. And there are like reports out there that will very easily free. Anyone can get them about anyone. Just tell them a website and they'll give you a report of how far they are on security of that. Just basically that kind of SSL layer. It's not the security of the entire company, right? It's a very, very small piece, but it's very visible. So I suggest you manage that and try to get to a very high score. You can also hire some third-party companies, like BitSite is one of the best-known ones, but there's several of them that will run a scan of any kind of domain that these companies have and the vendor has, and will give you a report on what they found on all those domains. Again, it's just the tip of the iceberg of security. So if you pass all these with flying colors, doesn't mean you're secure, but it goes a long way in communicating that you care about security, and at least you're managing the most visible parts of the cybersecurity of your business. Next, and this is probably the harder part, is actually getting secure, getting GDPR compliant, getting privacy deeply ingrained in your organization, and that's kind of, there's a lot of resources out there about doing this. So these are some very high level tips about walking the walk. So as a first step, you want to conduct that data privacy impact assessment, right? Kind of what data do I have? Why do I have it? How am I using it? Where am I storing it? How am I securing it? All that kind of stuff. To just give you an idea of what you have and be able to communicate to the customers, right? And then you kind of want to minimize that, what you're collecting and what you're processing, to, especially upfront when you're small, to just the minimum that you need, not everything you may need sometime in the future, which is always everything. And so if you just do this assessment and you recognize that you're actually collecting a bunch of sensitive data you don't need right now, and there'll be plenty of time later to collect it when you get bigger and have more customers, just don't collect it for now. Right, and then document all these processes, everything that you find out. That's also a GDPR requirement, at least the bigger companies. But be able to kind of show even the customer, not necessarily the regulator, that here's everything I do with the data. Next is establish that security baseline, right? Just the basic hygiene. Maybe as a first step, you can look at CIS or SANS, the top 20 critical security controls. You can go and find that PDF or the whole document that goes with it. Or if if you're ready to go one step further, it's probably right to get started with the NIST cybersecurity framework. That's sort of become the standard that most companies use, at least in the US. Or maybe ISO is still more common. Most companies do a little bit of both. But you may want to just look at the NIST cybersecurity framework and sort of get started with the most relevant parts over there. At a high level, you need to worry about all these 5 layers mentioned here, right? Identity access management and control for your users. Two-factor authentication is a very easy thing that ups your security significantly, and of course, just training your employees, etc. Next, at the data layer, right? Just encrypt those S3 buckets, right? And make sure you use SSL, TLS, HTTPS, whatever it is, for all data in transit, and have some plan on how to recover the data, some backup for data. Next, device and network. So that's all your like antivirus, firewalls, and really key is just to know what you have. Typically, when you're a small startup and kind of cloud native, it's a lot less of that, but it's still there. Applications. So have a security life cycle around the applications you're developing, the whole DevSecOps thing. Right, use code scanning tools. Make sure you patch whatever software you use regularly. Right, even if you're like using open source in the cloud, you want to make sure you're on the latest versions of that open source and not the real known buggy versions from a few years ago. And finally, detection and response. Right, just log everything that happens and hold on to those logs for a while and start putting together some sort of event monitoring and policies, and get some penetration testing to, once you have a bit of your game in order, to get some third-party experts to give you a report of how they're able to penetrate and what are kind of the biggest things to fix. Yeah, start looking at SOC 2, ISO, NIST, relevant industry certifications like HIPAA, PCI that you may need to begin with, depending on the industry you're in. And kind of really, really important, build a cybersecurity culture from the beginning. So training your employees, right, having a shared aspiration, just even talking about cybersecurity, celebrating successes related to cybersecurity, prioritizing security bug fixes, right? It doesn't help to say that you're always, to tell your employees all the time how security is so important, right? But then there's this massive backlog of known security vulnerabilities. You just never prioritize because you're always working on the next customer release, and these are kind of non-features. They're not going to help you close your next deal, so they just stay in the backlog. Your developers will ultimately get the message that security isn't that important. And kind of finally, if all else fails, consider buying cyber insurance. Most customers these days have it. Most vendors these days have it. I think customers have it too, and many customers will demand it, especially if you're a small startup. If something bad happens and they need to go after somebody, then you probably don't have the assets yet, but whatever cyber insurance company agreed to insure you, they're going to be able to cover whatever damage your solution may have caused. So they'll be looking for that. The other thing is it helps you get more mature because insurance companies aren't just going to insure anybody that wants to be insured, right? They have all their policies and their audits, and you'll have to demonstrate to them that you're secure enough to be worthy of insurance. So if you actually have the insurance, it's a sign that you have reached a certain level of maturity, and somebody who has an actual stake in the game, an insurance company that's gonna have to pay out if you screw up. They've actually looked at you, and kind of with experts knowing what they're doing, and determined that it's worth insuring you. So it's something you should definitely consider. All right, so I don't know, before we go to the parting thoughts, we have maybe 5 minutes for questions. How are we doing on time?
Yeah. Questions? Anyone? Thank you again, Jeff. This was great.
Thanks for having me. Let me, and if anybody wants to ask a question in the end. So first thing, if you're selling a customer, building selling products to a customer, even an established company or starting a new startup, sooner or later, an enterprise customer will ask. It used to be later. Now, based on what I'm hearing from the startups that I support, it's much, much sooner that their enterprise customers are asking about security. Right, when you get asked, or or kind of before you build your MVP, even on your current startup, right, you now understand where customers are coming from, and what they're looking for, right? Hopefully, you know where to start. Some of the tips that I've given in the deck here, and finally, remember that the customer security teams could actually be your greatest advocates, and this kind of connects to the next slide. Even if you're selling against SAP, we're this picture on the top. We have all this legacy. Even in our most cutting edge products, you'll find some code that may have been there for many, many, many years, or some IT systems, or sort of version 1 SaaS cloud from 20 years ago that are still powering some piece of this. Getting security around that is actually a pretty big challenge. There's a lot to rein in. We have a lot of complexity we have to deal with. And if you're that small startup starting from scratch, you have a very easy job sort of putting everything in order, and even convincing customers that you have anything in order, even against a company like SAP, simply because you started young without all this legacy, and you're thinking about it from day one, so you're doing it right. This is kind of a key advantage that you have in sort of getting past what may have been a lot of scary stuff that I've showed you or put your attention to that you now need to deal with. That's it. So again, if we have a question or two, we might be able to do them. If not, thank you very much. It's been fun.
There's a couple of comments from Kay and Lindy. They say,